Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame, and I want to do a real short video this week on the importance of paying attention to what's right behind your subject. This is a topic I've talked about before, but I saw these two images and I thought that this would provide me a good opportunity to talk about it in a slightly different way. So let's get to it. Now, both of these images were created by photographer Lionel Brient. He uses a Leica MP. He's a film shooter, so we don't have any XF information here. Now, one of the things I've talked about a lot before is that it's really important to stay aware of what's behind your subject, largely because you don't want distractions or you don't want to include images in the frame that or things in the frame that might detract from the viewer's attention on your subject. Because if there's a bunch of clutter or a bunch of visual noise, then the viewer doesn't know exactly where to look. We're not talking exactly about that here, but it's sort of along those same lines, because what's behind your subject not only controls how the viewer experiences your subject, but it also can help define your subject within the frame. Now, here we have this photograph that Lionel took of this woman bicycling in Florence. Now, what's key here is the area immediately behind her, which is this area of sky, and there's some buildings in the background, and the road that she's riding her bike on. The contrast that's created here is largely defined by how dark she is, the bike is, the basket that's on her bike, compared to everything else that's immediately behind her, particularly the sky. The brightness of the sky creates this very strong contrast between her head and her body that defines her head, her arm, and as we look down on the ground, it defines the shape of the tires, even the details of the spokes of the tires. And her shape and the shape of the bike is clearly defined because of that contrast between light and dark that exists within this area of the frame. Now, if she had pedaled a little more forward so that her body and her bike was juxtaposed to this, all this detail in her body, her arm, her head, possibly her legs here, would have been completely lost, because that darkness of the door would have been closely matching the darkness of her sweater, of her clothing, and it would have been completely lost. We might have seen definition on her face because the light is slightly coming overhead, but we would just see the definition of the bike because it still would be darker than this area here. But as soon as she moved here, all this stuff would be lost, and we wouldn't see that definition. That shape would be not as clearly defined. And that's something that's really kind of hard to discern when you're shooting color with the intent of later converting stuff over to black and white, because color in and of itself can create this sort of visual contrast to help define elements of your subject. But when you strip that away and you're only dealing with black and white tones, levels of gray, you don't have the color to fall back on. So that contrast between light and dark becomes all the more critical. So when you're evaluating a scene and you anticipate that you're going to photograph someone that's walking towards you or away from you or something along those lines, you really have to start assessing, well, how does this subject's tonality compare with the tonality of what's around them, of what I'm going to actually be putting behind them to make the photograph. If you're not paying attention to that, you only discover the reality of that when you pull up the image on your computer, and then you're a slave to having to use Photoshop or Lightroom in order to quote unquote fix it. And you don't want to fall into that trap. If you're using a mirrorless camera, you have the benefit of being able to set your camera to black and white mode, so you can see those tonalities right in front of your naked eye as you're shooting. With an SLR, you can use a black and white picture style mode, but you don't actually see the result until you've actually made the photograph. Either way, it can help you to sort of train your eye to get to this point, but it's really important to try and be conscious of it with your naked eye, whether or not you've made those changes on your camera. Now, let's take a look at another photograph that Lionel made. Now, here's another image also made in Florence, and look at this image in comparison with the other one. We're still dealing with that level of contrast, right? We're still dealing with having a subject that's really clearly defined. And here we're not dealing with a bright sky or anything like that. We're dealing with a wall here, this sort of brick wall, which is sort of a little darker than middle gray. But see, despite that, you can still see how the body of this man is clearly defined, because his jacket is darker than most of that brick face that he's walking across. Also, his hat is really clearly defined because his hat is actually brighter than that wall behind him. So his face is defined nicely because not only is the light falling overhead, but the place where his face juxtaposes against the wall has a nice area of contrast, especially that dark black line that's right behind his nose helps to define his nose rather nicely. Now imagine this shot. Had Lionel made this shot when the subject here was in this spot rather against this wall. If he had been here and Lionel had made the shot, we likely would have lost all this shape of the jacket, of the body, because this area here is very similar to this black area here. So the only thing that would probably have been easily definable or viewable in terms of our eye looking at the picture would have been the hat and the head. So Lionel made a great move in terms of being able to choose this space here in order to make his photograph, because it helps define all the important characteristics of his subject. And when you're out there on the street, it's really important to not only be on the hunt for interesting subject matter, it's also important to be on the hunt for good, interesting backgrounds against which subjects may be well defined, regardless of their shape or their size or anything like that. But especially if you're shooting black and white, it becomes even more important than it normally does with color photographs, just because you are so dependent on tonality in order to make a good picture. I hope you found that helpful. The Candid Frame is actually a podcast, an interview show in which I feature conversations with some of the world's best photographers from all over the world, from different genres of photography. Our latest conversation was with Filipino photographer Hannah Reyes Morales. She's a documentary photographer and photojournalist based in Manila. Great photographer and a wonderful story to tell. You can check it out by going to thecandidframe.com. And you can access our complete archive of interviews, which are over 345 interviews going back over 10 years, by accessing the Candid Frame app. You can see links. You'll find links for it here. It's available for Android, Apple iOS, and Windows. And it's completely free. So you can access every conversation that I've had and use it on your tablet or your phone and listen to it at your convenience. So you're usually run about 45 minutes each, and regardless of what genre of photography you're interested in, you'll find a conversation that will entertain and inspire you. At least I hope it will. And if you like what you're seeing here, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and spread the word. All right, thanks again for joining us, and I'll see you next time.